Does it work well if I stand here? Is the sound good? Nobody's nodding. Okay. Yeah? Okay, it feels a bit like a circus stage somehow, or a stadium rock concert. I never knew it was like this, to be exposed from every single angle. I think it was better when Francis was sitting down. Is that helpful? Or am I too short, so it's almost the same? Okay, I'll try. Please shout if you can't hear me. So first of all, thank you, Sophia, for this wonderful invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Dundee, so it's great to be exposed to so many artists and so many projects happening here in such a short time. I have to say, taking part of a 24 hours, might feel like it, 12-hour Jamming Symposium is quite an intense experience. It's probably a durational experience, and I've never played in a band, and that's something that I've become quite aware of during this day here, that it's somewhat out of my comfort zone to be standing here, but let's see how it works. So I've sort of decided to go with the suggestion that lies in this title of a jamming symposium, that there's some kind of musical framework at play in terms of how we discuss collaboration today. And that led me to start off the contribution I will make to the discussions today with a musical anecdote of some kind that questions the direction of organization of both the self and the collective. And a couple of years ago, I was working as an art theorist at the school where I'm now the dean, Fynen Art Academy in Denmark. And it's basically a 5-year independent study program that doesn't accredit BFAs or MFAs. They get a diploma in the end, and it's sort of the equivalent as having done 5 years higher education. The size of the school is very intimate. There's only 65 students, and the daily life is certainly marked by the fact that we operate outside of the Bologna reform. And that means that we attempt to embrace a teaching that is non-linear in its model, and also within the education itself, try to create room for the students to have the power and the agency to question and criticize the actual structure of how we operate. So there are no departments, and the teaching is primarily workshop-based and offered up across the years. So when I arrived there, having previously taught in university context that seems to favor the lecture format, it was refreshing for me to be able to think about another kind of engagement with the students that was primarily organized around workshops and seminars. And as the art theorist, which was sort of a role I always felt a little uncomfortable with, I often decided to invite artists to come and co-teach with me, because I felt that was a good way of perhaps bridging the complicated relationship between theory and practice. And today I'll be speaking about one particular workshop that stood out for me, and I think it might have stood out for the students as well, perhaps because it was the most annoying thing they had ever been invited to take part in, I don't know. But it was special in many regards, and that was a workshop I did with the Basque artist called Martin. Martin flew in when we were to do the workshop, and when he arrived, he said to me instantly, "I have the flu. I've really got a bad fever." And I thought, okay, we can cancel. You know, it's not ideal. You're here, but it doesn't seem like you're really in a situation where you can go through with this teaching. And he insisted, no, let's just get some Panodil sap. They're called in Denmark. They're very efficient when you have a fever, at least for a while, and then you start to feel the pain again. So we went to 7-Eleven and we did that, and he insisted to just start the workshop. And this sense of being quite hardcore in the approach to that situation is something that also defines his artistic practice. For those of you who are not familiar with him, his main field of interest is the relationship between noise and capitalism. And many of his projects and collaborations strive towards altering the conventional relationships of collaborations and the conventions of a performance or a concert in itself. And that means to use and destabilize the relationship between the performer and the audience. And speaking about this, it's also quite interesting to be exposed to this situation here. So the workshop that Martin and I decided to do with our students was called Towards a Conceptual Improvisation. And it took its starting point in a proposition that Martin was making, and I'm quoting now. Improvisation has so far only been about expressing the self. What we need is the dissolution of the self in order to work towards subjective depersonalization. So basically this workshop was an attempt to explore how the notions of concept and improvisation sit in relation to each other. And we wanted to explore how we could work with the parameters that usually define the performance, or in Martin's word, the spectacle, and how that could in itself become the material for the improvisation. And that means to work with the division between the performer, and the audience, the stage, and the expectations at play in that situation. So basically we were asking, would it be possible to create a collective instrument that belonged to no one, while disregarding any distinctions between being passive or being active in this situation? And traditionally, improvisation has been about emphasizing the experience of the moment, which is supposed to work against its own representation, whereas concepts require reflexivity, understanding, language, and therefore representation. So in conceptual art, concepts work like statements from the authority of the artist, while in improvisation, concepts can be put forward without anyone needing to really know who is framing the frame at that moment. And improvisation has usually been connected to an understanding of individuals expressing themselves freely, either in a group or in a solo situation. But Martin's approach was very different. He wanted to question the potential of free will, basically. And instead, he was very skeptical of the role of the improviser, because he felt that the role of the improviser in a performance comes very close to the perfect capitalist subject, in the sense that the improviser excels in expressing him or herself, being unique, developing individuality, being self-motivating and self-promoting, and being free. So on the first day of the workshop, it was announced that Martin would do a concert on that night, and it was scheduled to happen between 8 and 9 p.m. Basically, that was all the information everyone received. And Martin is renowned for his ear-bleeding, really loud noise concerts. So the setup in the auditorium was, in fact, very sparse. We had 2 huge speakers like these, and then a microphone in the middle. There was no seating arrangement like this. That was it. That was the stage. Martin was all dressed in black, and in that sense really was living up to the expectations of what a hardcore noise artist would look like. And we all started to gather. And finally Martin got on stage, which meant he got in front of the microphone. But he didn't really speak. Nothing really happened. For the first 15 minutes, he would once in a while say a few things. It would be very limited what he would communicate, but it would always be from the perspective of I, such as I'm standing here on stage. But reading his body language, it was quite obvious that he was somewhat unease, feeling unease with the situation. After the first 15 minutes were over, he started to look at us, the audience, and he started to speak about us. He said, "You're standing here looking at me." And then another 15 minutes went by. Then he started to speak about us. He started to unite the I and the you, and speak about the experience that we were sharing. And then he took my arm and he made me leave the room with him. And for the last 15 minutes of this performance, he went into the storage room with me and closed the door. And now he said, "We're speaking about them. We're speaking about the people left in the auditorium, the audience, the students of this workshop." It was one very long hour, and especially the last 15 minutes was extremely painful for me. When we came back to the auditorium, a few students had actually stayed, and I don't think I was exaggerating when I say that I felt there was a certain tension in the air. And perhaps a bit of resentment. So the situation was in that sense strange for everyone, and that was the first day of the workshop. I'll return to what happened next in a short while. So as a student and as a teacher, deciding how to engage with the framework of the academy, how to navigate its structures, its implicit or explicit hierarchies, dealing with the mutual expectations at play between the individual student on one hand and the institution on the other hand isn't easy. A flexible institutional framework is demanding and hard work. And for most students, the major job lies in developing their artistic practice when they're at art school. And being involved in formulating and defining a structure requires active engagement. And it is up to everyone to figure out how they wish to engage with the framework that is the institution at that moment, whether they wish to be involved in shaping it for a period of time, and how they manage to organize themselves in relation to it. And this perception of self-organization goes beyond an oppositional position, which is mutually exclusive to the institution. And instead of focusing on challenging the relationships in our society, and in this case also the relationship between the self and the organized community of the academy, that is something that could be perceived as a role of an art student at art school, I would say. Because a fixed structure is very easy to criticize, but the absence of a structure is not always as liberating as it might sound. Instability only allows for interruption and potentially subversive modes as long as it doesn't exist like that just to be unstable, because it can equally just produce frustration and exhaustion. And it actually takes great effort for everyone to be able to convert this flexible model into something that is a productive modus operandi. So thinking about self-organization as a method that's very important for contemporary art production, and considering the potential status that it holds today, were some of the triggering points for my colleague Anne Schäfer-Carlsen and I when we came together to work on editing the anthology Self-Organized, which came out last year. I did have a slideshow, but it was quite boring, and I felt there was so much else to look on here. So I hope you'll bear with me. I didn't even bring a copy of the book. I'm sorry about that. It's very pink, as Francis was saying. So Anna and I were working as curators and educators, and both of us worked independently and institutionally. And we were actively involved in questioning the complicated relationships that seemed to underpin our own work. Anna trained as an artist, and I trained as an art historian, and I think this experience of moving between different platforms, working as a freelancer, working as a director of an institution, but still feeling like a freelancer in many ways, and operating with multiple voices was something that I think a lot of you probably share, and something that made us feel that it was important to reassess these otherwise fixed positions that the art world is sometimes perceived as having. So the problem of how to position the self-organized within quite a paradoxical and changing environment was something that informed the analysis of the book. And one particular event became quite important for how we decided to structure the book. And that was a project that both of us took part in, a bit on the side. It was an event that was held at Tate Modern in 2010 called No Soul for Sale, a Festival of Independence. And I think there were quite a few Scottish initiatives taking part as well in this event. It was the second installment of this exhibition project that had happened the first time in New York at the X Initiative. And when it came to Tate Modern, it was supposed to be an important moment to celebrate 10 years of institutional service for this museum institution. And it was held in the Turbine Hall. Those of you familiar with the space knows that it's huge. And each independent project space was given a little square that was demarcated with red stripes, and then they were supposed to do whatever they wanted during the event that lasted for a weekend. Basically, the overall experience functioned as kind of a chaotic bazaar. A lot of visitors asked, is this a flea market? Well, I mean, it was very confusing, and maybe this would now have been helpful to have an image of. It was definitely a chaotic visual experience, and also with a lot of people. 90,000 people came over that weekend. But the overall experience was also something that was quite striking, because it taught us a lot about the dynamics of how the art world works. because unfortunately the museum didn't offer any financial support to the contributors that participated in this celebration of the museum. Everyone traveled there on their own, and the production that they delivered for this exhibition project was something that they financed themselves. And the fact that most of the participants so readily accepted these conditions was quite striking, because it somehow showed us how the institutional embrace is still very important, even for the self-organized scene. Obviously, a lot of these participants would probably never ever have received an invitation to exhibit at Tate Modern if it wasn't for this particular event. But it also showed how there was a mutual dependency at play, because the museum desired to have this particular energy that the project spaces could deliver, that the heavy museum bureaucracy couldn't themselves manifest. So both Anna and I were invited by 2 different project spaces exhibiting for this exhibition. I was working with a Turkish initiative called PIST, because I had done a residency in Istanbul, and while I had been in the city, we had had a lot of conversations about what does it mean to be independent, because that was something that they claimed. Their project space was an independent project space. And in Turkey, that probably means something else than it does in Scandinavia, where everyone is funded by public money. That doesn't exist in Turkey and in many other places of the world. But then you're independent of what when you operate in this kind of sense, as PIST was? Are you independent of the market? Are you independent of the power of the institution? Or are you independent from help from your friends? It seemed like this independent position, whether as a curator or as an artist, was something that seemed to rely heavily on various support structures. And it may operate without money, very often it does, with very limited budget, but it never seems to exist outside of a gift economy. And that was something that led us to think more about also the terminology that exists in this field of self-organization and the need to reassess that. Because for Anna and I, it was important to create an anthology that didn't look at self-organization as part of an opposing dichotomy, which had the institution on one side and the self-organized on the other side, because we didn't feel that that was a valid definition any longer. When we were working on commissioning and researching for the contributors for the book, it became more and more clear to us that we wanted to focus on self-organization beyond those limiting labels of speaking about the non-profit, the artist-run, or the alternative. Instead, we felt that the choice to be self-organized was something to address, because it implies a certain dualistic dependency between the self, an individual, and the organized community within society. And it's not always about having a division between the institution and the non-institution. The current thinking around self-organization seems to be far more complex. And in that sense also acknowledge that self-organization no longer just exists on a grassroots level. Instead, it reaches across new networks and new platforms that often entails institutions collaborating with non-institutional platforms. So this also became important in terms of who to choose to contribute to such an anthology discussing self-organization. And we wanted to both invite writers, artists, art historians, curators, critics, as well as museum directors, because we were interested in getting their singular take on what self-organization is, or what it could be, based on their own experiences, and to analyze it both from an empirical and analytical or a theoretical perspective that would somehow mirror the diversity of the field. Another reason to do this book was also that we felt there was a huge boom in history writing about the self-organized. Everywhere we went, we would go to bookshops, and there would be this coffee table book, often very glossy, very beautifully produced, very expensive looking, that would be for a small initiative that you might never have heard of, but that suddenly had put their history out there. Suddenly they were writing themselves into art history. And it was interesting to us that somehow these self-organized initiatives were operating with similar strategies as their institutional cousins would do. And that also created a new dynamic about how the self-organized situates itself today, whether it's still in an outsider position or if it's somehow interested in transforming itself into an institutional structure or mimicking or performing an institution when that is necessary or desirable for a funding body, for politicians, whoever that might be. And it certainly is dangerous to claim that self-organization is the savior of everything and that it holds transformative potential in itself, because something that also became very clear when working on this book was that the role of the entrepreneur that the artist is often put in, it can very often resemble business management jargon and also holds the position that resembles capitalism's very efficient capacity to just absorb the alternative. And several of our contributors speak with hope about other ideas or ways of imagining a way out of the current production paradigm. I don't think any one of them really holds the answer. The artist Celine Condorelli speaks about friendship, that also was mentioned earlier today as a very important support structure for another way of living. The curator Barnaby Drabel speaks about the necessity to de-organize, particularly from his perspective, where the curator is the Uber manager of everything. So he speaks about switching off the synchronization of the iPad, the iPhone, and the iMac, and basically relax to the sum of the devices being switched off. VHV, the curatorial collective, speaks about the need to withdraw and basically introduce a pause, to wait. And that is not to remove yourself from the discussions, but instead to give yourself time to reflect on developing new ways of engaging, and also to experience new methods instead of just constantly pushing yourself to be working at the pace that's expected. So returning to where I started at this workshop with Martine, on the last day of the workshop, we all reconvened and we came together for an attempt to collectively perform a non-concert. This situation turned out to be equally challenging as Martine's concert. We were giving the following instructions. If a concert is based on agreement, accord, harmony, then a non-concert is based on disagreement, discord, and noise. Non-idiomatic improvisation is supposed to treat all music as potential material for improvisation. But music is never just about music. In a non-concert, we could use everything possible as material for improvisation. Power relations, ideas, concepts, the context, history, architecture, our bodies, affects, desire, sex. Anything could happen if we make it happen, but if the situation turns out sterile for you, blame yourself for it. That was the statement of what a non-concert could be. And what I mainly remember from this 1 hour long non-concert was being watched. Martine and I were somehow expected or desired by the students to take a lead in this very difficult situation. And when that didn't happen, we ended up spending quite a lot of time blaming ourselves and each other for performing a situation that was not a very good or very interesting non-concert. Because did we actually feel free to be exploring the limitations in how we think? Who was framing the situation? And who had managerial ownership of it? It was a struggle to dislocate the accepted ways of behaving, and some decided to leave. Perhaps the reason why some stayed was that they had a sincere interest, or perhaps they were concerned that they would get absence and not receive full credit for the workshop. Since the Academy doesn't grade the students, instead we take presence during workshops, and a certain percentage is needed in order to pass the year. So what finally happened was that one student plugged her phone into the stereo. We still had the setup from Martine's concert, so the 2 speakers and the microphone, but nobody got behind the microphone. But behind our back, she had plugged her iPhone into the stereo, and suddenly it came about that she, without our knowledge, had recorded Martine and I in conversation leading up to the non-concert, and this was being blasted out into the room. So almost simultaneously to this happening, a student who hadn't attended the workshop came bursting into the auditorium, and he came with a box filled of beer because he wanted to celebrate his birthday and he couldn't find any of his co-students in the communal kitchen. Almost as a choir, a sigh of relief just emanated from everyone. and that was the non-concert. Thank you.